NBC News and other news organizations have been keeping a close watch on the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., where Special Prosecutor Jack Smith's grand jury has been investigating the activity of Donald Trump and his associates attempting to overturn the last presidential election leading up to and on January 6th. There appeared to be no grand jury activity at the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. today. The January 6th grand jury usually meets on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and so that means the next likely meeting of that grand jury is Thursday. Most observers believe that that means that Donald Trump will not be indicted by that grand jury until Thursday. But this time might be different. This time, we might not get our usual tip about when Donald Trump is indicted. Our usual tip comes publicly from the defendant himself, Donald Trump. That is how the news media and the world learned that Donald Trump was being indicted the first time in Manhattan and the second time in southern Florida. Prosecutors told Donald Trump and his lawyers so they could arrange his surrender for arrest and arraignment. And then Donald Trump, unlike any other defendant, almost immediately told the world. The first Donald Trump indictment that was announced, he announced he was going to be indicted, and he begged his followers to come to Manhattan and rise up in protest against Donald Trump being indicted. They did not come. You might think of Manhattan as very unfriendly territory to Donald Trump. You might make the mistake of thinking there are no Trump supporters in Manhattan. In fact, 85,000 people in Manhattan alone voted for Donald Trump. In the city of New York, over 691,000 people voted for Donald Trump. More people voted for Donald Trump in New York City alone than in 7 Republican states won by Donald Trump. And those millions of voters in New York City and the many millions more in the surrounding areas of New Jersey and Connecticut within an hour of the courthouse in Manhattan all stayed away when Donald Trump was arrested and arraigned there, despite Donald Trump begging them to come. Only a couple of dozen people showed up outside the courthouse that day. I was there that day walking among them, and they were less enthusiastic than any New York sports fans. And it was worse for Donald Trump when he was arraigned in Florida, a state that Donald Trump won. The protest turnout was just as low as in Manhattan and much quieter, much more subdued. The so-called protesters were there because TV cameras were there, and the protesters were desperately just hoping to get a chance to wave to their friends on TV at home. There have been no real protests of Donald Trump's arrests. None. No marching in the street anywhere. No noise at all in all 50 states. Donald Trump surely realizes by now that if and when he gets arrested and arraigned in Washington, D.C., he will set a record low for so-called protest turnout at one of his arrests. Virtually everyone willing to go to Washington, D.C. to protest violently for Donald Trump is either in prison tonight or awaiting trial. Donald Trump should know tonight that he can only embarrass himself again by publicly announcing that he has been indicted before he is arrested and arraigned. Donald Trump knows he's not going to get any kind of protest turnout at all for his next arrest in Washington, D.C. And Donald Trump doesn't want a rerun, possibly a louder rerun, of what he got when he had to show up at the Manhattan courthouse again for the New York Attorney General's lawsuit against him.
New York hates you. 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 New York hates you.
That's That's what Donald Trump gets for letting them know that he's coming. Announcing the timing of his arrest ahead of time really only serves to make life easier for me and thousands of other people working in the news business, especially the television news business. So you got to ask yourself tonight, does Donald Trump really want to do Lawrence O'Donnell another favor and let him know now whether I'm going to have to be working on Friday night? This might be the time when we discover the old-fashioned way that Donald Trump has been indicted. We might not discover it until Special Prosecutor Jack Smith reveals it in court. Maybe we won't discover it until the biggest news industry stakeout of the year at the courthouse in Washington, D.C., sees the orange hair pop out of the car on its way into Donald Trump's next arrest and arraignment. That's when we might discover it. Yesterday, Donald Trump said that indictment in Washington, D.C. could be coming, quote, any day now. Christopher Krebs, who served as the head of cybersecurity in the Trump administration, has revealed that he is cooperating with Special Prosecutor Jack Smith's investigation of the events leading up to and on January 6th. Jack Smith is focusing on a meeting at the Trump White House 10 months before the election in which Donald Trump not only agreed with the administration's security experts that American election infrastructure had been considerably improved during the Trump administration, Donald Trump actually discussed taking public credit for securing our voting system, the same voting system that he would begin attacking months later. NBC News is reporting that in that meeting in the White House, quote, officials from multiple agencies, including the FBI, Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, laid out why it's extraordinarily difficult for hacking or fraud to change the results of a U.S. election. Trump was receptive to the message and spoke about holding a news conference on the topic, though he never did, two people familiar with it said. Christopher Krebs was in that meeting and has surely shared with Jack Smith's investigators what Donald Trump said. That meeting could be evidence that Donald Trump knew that he was lying later in the year when he claimed there was widespread election fraud. In the days after the presidential election in 2020, Christopher Krebs issued an official statement from his cybersecurity department saying there is no evidence that any voting system deleted or lost votes, changed votes, or was in any way compromised. Donald Trump then promptly fired Christopher Krebs for telling that inconvenient truth, inconvenient only to Donald Trump. The other indictment of Donald Trump that could come any day now would happen in Georgia, where Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis has been investigating Donald Trump and his allies. The Guardian reports that District Attorney Willis has, quote, weighed several potential statutes under which to charge, including solicitation to commit election fraud and conspiracy to commit election fraud, according to two people briefed on the matter. Among the state election law charges that prosecutors were examining, criminal solicitation to commit election fraud and conspiracy to commit election fraud, as well as solicitation of a public or political officer to fail to perform their duties, and solicitation to destroy, deface, or remove ballots, the people said. The district attorney is also seeking to charge at least some of the Trump operatives who were involved in accessing voting machines and copying sensitive election data in Coffee County, Georgia, in January 2021, with computer trespass crimes, the two people said. District Attorney Willis has indicated that indictments could be forthcoming there in the first 2 weeks of August.